Okay, how you guys doing? Hopefully you guys find this video and I'll be able to watch it here real soon. I told you guys in your assignment, or not your assignment, your email yesterday that we are not taking the Chapter 2 test today. We're going to take that on the 16th when we come back. Hopefully we'll be back on the 16th. We're going to take it then. So we are going to start Chapter 3 stuff, okay? So anyhow, this stuff that we're covering over these next week and a half or so until we come back will not be on your test. Okay, that's Chapter 2 test. So we're taking this Chapter 3 stuff, so try not to mix the stuff up. This chapter is going to start out, it's going to be kind of a difficult one, okay? We're going to introduce a concept today that a lot of students struggle with, okay? So this is a video you might want to watch at least a couple times perhaps. So anyhow, we're just going to dive into the assignment. I'm going to explain it as we go, okay? If you looked at section 3-1, and it's up now, section 3.1 is up right now, we're not going to start with the very first question on the assignment. I think it starts on question 3. We're actually going to start on question number 13, okay? Question number 13. We're eventually going to back up and hit those questions, but question number 3 starts right off with some really difficult ones. Start with a little bit easier ones first, okay? So, section 3-1, we look at number 13. They tell you to solve this using square roots. It says x squared equals 144. X squared is 144. Now, what you need to understand is this. As a general rule, and we'll talk about this more later, the power, the degree, in this case, 2, tells you how many solutions there are. There are 2 solutions to this, okay? If it was to the raised to the power of 3, there would be 3 solutions. If it was to the power of 8, there would be 8 solutions, okay? So we're solving quadratics, so we're going to be looking for 2 answers most of the time, okay? And we'll talk about why sometimes it's not always 2 answers later on. So this does have 2 answers, okay? Now it's saying what squared gives you 144? Well, what you need to understand is this. The way you get rid of squares is by square rooting, okay? Squaring and square rooting, a lot of times students think, oh, they're the same thing. They're total opposites, okay? Just like adding and subtracting are opposites, multiplying and dividing are opposites, squaring and square rooting are opposites, okay? When you square something, that means you times it by itself. When you square root it, it's asking you to find the number that you can times by itself to get that number, okay? For example, 9. If you square 9, it's 81. But if you take 9 and square root it, one of the answers is 3, because 3 times 3 is 9, okay? So they're total opposites, okay? So what you need to understand, though, is this. To get rid of the square, we're going to square root, and that's kind of that funky looking, looks like a divide symbol, kind of like, with a little check mark there. But if I square root this side, I square root this side. These things destroy each other. So you're just left with x equals. Now, the square root of 144, you may or may not know this, is 12, because 12 times 12 is 144. But we said we're supposed to have 2 answers. That's only 1, okay? The other answer is negative 12. And the reason is because 12 times 12 is 144. And negative 12 times negative 12 is also 144. So it's 12 and negative 12. So to make it easier, whenever you put a square root symbol in, we have something called this. This symbol. It looks like a plus sign and a minus sign. That's called a plus or minus symbol. Okay? Plus or minus. Whenever you add in a radical, the square root is, a radical is called a square root symbol. So square root symbol is called a radical. Okay? Whenever you add in a radical, this original problem said this. There was no radical symbol. I put the radical symbol in here, though, and I need to slip a little plus or minus symbol there. So instead of saying 12 comma negative 12, I could have said plus or minus 12. It's the same thing. Plus or minus 12 means 12, as well as negative 12. Okay? So hopefully that one wasn't that bad. They're going to get quite a bit tougher, though. When you look at number 15, it says x minus 6 squared is 25. X minus 6 squared equals 25. Is that what it says? Yes, it is, okay? So they ask you to solve with square roots, okay? So to get rid of the square, we square root, put the plus or minus symbol here. So these destroy each other. You're left with x minus 6 equals, the square root of 25 is 5. So it's plus or minus 5. But I'm going to actually write it down. X minus 6 could equal 5 or negative 5, okay? Now we're not done. We got to get x by itself. We can get rid of that minus 6 by adding 6 here, and we add 6 to each of these. If we do that, these cancel. X equals 5 plus 6, or x equals negative 5 plus 6, which is 1. So which is it, 11 or 1? It's both. And you need both answers in order to get full credit, okay? So, the only thing we did here is we square rooted, put the plus or minus symbol, and then we added 6 to each answer, okay? That one's a little more difficult. Let's see what number 17 looks like. Let's see, 17. So we have 4x minus 1 squared. 4 x minus 1 squared, then what? Plus 2 equals 10. Plus 2 equals 10. Plus 2 equals 10. Okay, so before we square root, we haven't had to talk about this yet, you got to have what's squared be all by itself. Okay, so when we look at this, what's being squared is x minus 1. So we got to get x minus 1 squared by itself. So let's get rid of this plus 2, subtracting 2. So we have 4, x minus 1 squared equals 10 minus 2, which is 8. And then we got to get rid of this 4 by dividing by 4, because parentheses means multiply. So we have x minus 1 squared equals 8 divided by 4, which is 2. Okay? Now what's squared is by itself. So we have to get rid of that square by square rooting. So we square root and we square root. These cancel, so we have x minus 1 equals, don't forget the plus or minus symbol. Okay? Now the square root of 2, be careful. Okay? Some students will think it's 1. It's not 1, because 1 times 1 is not 2, it's 1. So what is the square root of 2? Well, it's the square root of 2. Okay, if it was the square root of 9, you'd say 3. If it's the square root of 4, you'd say 2. Square root of 2 is just the square root of 2. Just leave it as plus or minus radical 2. And then the last thing we have to do is get rid of this minus 1 by putting plus 1 here, plus 1 here. These cancel, x equals, and I'm going to write this plus 1 in front, so 1 plus or minus radical 2. There are two answers there. One of them is 1 plus the square root of 2, whatever that is. The other one is 1 minus the square root of 2. Okay, not very nice numbers, but that's the way it is sometimes. Sometimes the answers come out kind of yucky. Okay? Okay, all right, so the next question on the assignment is 27. That's where they start getting tougher. So here's what we're going to do. We're actually going to back up now and look at question number 3. Question number 3. All right, so number 3. They tell us to solve these first ones by graphing. We're not going to graph them, okay? We're going to solve them a different way. It says x squared plus 3x plus 2 equals 0. X squared plus 3x plus 2 is 0. X squared plus 3x plus 2 equals 0. Now, you can't use square roots on this one, okay? The first few problems we've done, we solved by using square roots. And the difference is, these have two x's. They have an x squared and an x. You can't use square roots to solve it, okay? We have to do something called factoring, okay? Factoring. Now, I'm hoping that you at least were introduced to factoring in algebra, okay? And it's been maybe a year or two since you've done it. You might have forgotten how to do it. Factoring's huge, okay? Factoring is a big concept that you've got to know coming out of this class after this year's over, okay? There's certain things in this class you don't necessarily have to know how to do. I mean, graphing absolute value functions, those V-shaped graphs, if you don't know how to graph those, can you pass this class? Yeah, it's not the end of the world if you can't learn that, okay? Factoring is something you got to know. You've got to know how to factor when you get out of this class, okay? And I'm going to be right up front with you guys. If you struggle with your times tables, you'll struggle even more with factoring. If you really know your times tables, it will be easier. And when I say know your times tables, I mean literally know them. If I ask you what's 3 times 5 and you go 15, you don't know 3 times 5. You know how to count by 3s to 15. But it's you got to know. If you know them like clockwork, if you know 7 times 8 is 56, you know 8 times 3 is 24, it will be easier. Okay, if you know your times tables. So here's what you do. First off, if it's a quadratic, and everything in this chapter is going to be a quadratic for the most part, it has to equal 0. Well, so far so good. Okay, if it equaled 7, we'd have to subtract 7 to each side. We got to have one side 0. Okay, and we do have 0, so that's good. Okay, and then we look for a common factor. We look at, there's a 1 right here, you just don't see it, a 3 and a 2. What goes into 1, 3, and 2 besides 1? Don't ever pick 1. Because 1 goes into everything, okay? It's kind of a waste of time to factor a 1 out, okay? So what goes into 1, 3, and 2 besides 1? Nothing. Can I factor an x out of each of these terms? Is x common to each of them? Well, there's an x here, there's an x here. There's not one here, so you can't factor out an x from all of them, okay? So the next step is an easy step. You draw 2 sets of parentheses. Equals 0. We look at our first term. How do you multiply and make x squared? Well, x times x, okay? And then you look at your last term, not your middle term, but your last term. How do you multiply and make a positive 2? First off, just a positive number. How do you multiply and make a positive? Well, a positive times a positive, or a negative times a negative? Well, I don't see any negatives anywhere, so it's going to be a positive and a positive. Now, a little trick that you can use for right now, but eventually you won't be able to use, and we'll talk about that later, is I want to know, how do you times to 2? And also, we've ignored this right here, add to 3. There's only one way to times to get 2. 1 times 2. And that works because 1 and 2 add up to 3. You want to times to 2, add to 3. Now I could have put 1 and 2 or 2 and 1. It doesn't matter because my first terms are the same. Now, we're taking this times this and getting 0. So either this is 0 or this is 0. Okay, when I times two things together and get 0 for an answer, one of them's got to be 0. So what would make this 0? Negative 1. Negative 1 plus 1 is 0. What would make this 0? Negative 2. Negative 2 plus 2 is 0. So what's the answer? Negative 1 or negative 2? Both of them. Okay? That's the beginning of factoring, okay? Now, if you got it, fantastic. But, you know, they're going to get tougher, okay? That was an easier one, okay? If you're still struggling with this, I would stop and back up the tape and watch it again, this problem, before you move on, okay? Let's look at question number 5. Question number 5, we have 0 equals x squared minus 9. Okay, now this one we actually can use square roots on because there's only one x. We can do that. So I'm going to add 9 each side. Add 9. 0 plus 9 is 9. These cancel, x squared. Then the way you get rid of a square is by square rooting. And then these cancel. And don't forget to put the plus or minus symbol here. The square root of 9 is 3. So plus or minus 3. So 3 and negative 3. Okay? Now, you might be sitting there going, I thought it had to equal 0. You made it equal 9. It has to equal 0 if you're factoring. We didn't factor this one. We use square roots, okay? Whenever you factor, it's got to equal 0. Okay? When you use square roots, it doesn't have to equal 0. Let's go to number 7. Okay, we have 8x equals negative 4. Negative 4, then what? Minus 4x squared. Okay, we can't use square roots on this one, all right? Because we have 2 x's, all right? We got to equal 0. So we either got to make this 0 or that 0. I'm going to get rid of this stuff. I'm going to get rid of that minus 4 by adding 4 to each side. We get rid of the negative 4x squared by adding 4x squared to each side. If I do that, the entire right side goes away. Now, are there any like terms here? Can I put together 8x or 4 or 4x squared? No, I can't put them together. So I'm going to put 4x squared first, then 8x, and then 4. Okay, now we said we look for a common factor. Is there a common factor of 4 and 8 and 4? Is there something that goes into 4, 8, and 4? You might say, well, 2 does. 2 goes into all of them, and it does. 4 actually does. So you like the bigger number. The bigger the better. So we can factor a 4 out. Can I take an x out of each of these? No. This doesn't have an x. So I just put a 4, and ask yourselves, 4 times what is 4x squared? Well, x squared. Plus 4 times what is 8x? 2x. 4 times what gives you 4? 1. Okay, now have we factored it? Yes. Completely? No, not yet. It factors even further. So this may sound like I'm treating you like a little kid here, but you know what you do this for? Just cover it up. Don't even look at it. Just ignore it. It's there, but just don't look at it. So if you remember, we draw our 2 sets of parentheses, and we look at x squared. X times x is x squared. Then we look at our last term. It's a positive. How do you multiply and make a positive? Either a plus and a plus, or a minus times a minus. Well, there's no negative, so it's plus plus. And how do you times to 1? Well, there's only one way to times to get 1. 1 times 1. And that works because they add up to 2. So 1 and 1. We still have that 4 there. So we're timesing and getting 0. So either this is 0 or this is 0. What makes 0 here? Negative 1. Negative 1 plus 1 is 0. This also is negative 1. So this is what I was talking about. We're supposed to have 2 answers. Do we have 2 answers? Well, kind of. Okay? We have the same answer twice. Okay? Now, do you have to write negative 1 and negative 1? No. Just negative 1 is good. Okay? That's all you have to do for that. Just negative 1. Okay? All right. Let's look at, okay, then, all right, now we're caught up. We're up to 13. We already did 17, 19. Now we're on to number 27. On to number 27. More factoring, okay? Just so you know, I don't want to scare anybody here, but I'm going to be right up front with you guys. We're going to factor a lot in this chapter, not just this section, this whole chapter. We're going to be factoring a lot. And once we finish this chapter, don't think, oh, I'm glad we're done factoring. We're going to continue factoring a lot this year, okay? So we have 0 equals x squared plus 6x plus 9. 0 equals x squared. Okay, so as factoring goes, and I don't want to make you feel bad if you are struggling with this right now, but this is one of the easier ones, okay? So once I do this problem, if you're still struggling, you might want to back it up and watch it again, because they're going to get progressively tougher. You want to make sure you can do the easier ones before you get to the tougher ones, okay? We can't use square roots. We have to factor because there's two x's. It equals 0. That's great, okay? So, what goes into 1, 6, and 9 besides 1? Nothing. Can I take an x out of each of these? Nope. So we draw our two sets of parentheses. X squared is x times x. We look at our last term. To make a positive, it's either a plus and a plus or a minus and a minus. There are no negatives, so it's plus plus. If you're wondering, is it always plus plus? No. It has been so far, but that's just the way it is. They'll start getting tougher, and we'll have negatives in there. And the two numbers here are 3 and 3, because 3 times 3 is 9, and 3 plus 3 is 6. Times to this, add to that. So what makes 0 here? Negative 3 and negative 3. Again, you only need to write one of them. You don't need to do both of them. Okay? So it's just negative 3. Okay, number 29. There's 29 at. So we have x squared minus 8x. Squared minus 8x equals negative 12. Equals negative 12. Okay, so first off, two x's, we have to factor. It's supposed to equal 0. It doesn't equal 0. We got to make this equal 0 by adding 12. So we do that, we have x squared minus 8x plus 12 equals 0. Now, is there a common factor? Is there anything that goes into 1, 8, and 12 besides 1? No. They don't all have x's, so we can't take an x out. So we draw our two sets of parentheses. X squared is x and x. We ignore our middle term, we look at our last term. How do you multiply and make a positive? Well, plus plus, or it could be a minus minus. Well, there is a negative here. Now, here's what you don't do. Some students will go, oh, well, it's minus plus, so you put minus plus. No, no, no. To make a positive, it's either a plus and a plus, or a negative and a negative. We got to have some sort of negative, so it's got to be negative, negative. Okay? Now, how do you times to make 12? Well, you might say 3 and 4. Well, 3 and 4 do times to 12, but they don't add up to 8. They add up to 7, which is close, but not close enough. It's got to be perfect. What it works out to be is 2 and 6, because they times to 12.